Okay folks, hello, we're going to talk through the 1D question now from the Germany paper. 1D, you'll remember, is the how useful question, and it's worth 8 marks, so one that's really worth trying to get right and trying to prepare for. So we're going to talk through this example that came from last year's paper when they asked how useful is source E for understanding Nazi economic policies. So you'll see that source E is a cartoon that was published in 1939 in America, and it was drawn by 2 Jewish journalists who'd worked in Europe in the 1930s, and they'd left Europe on the advice of their friends in December 1938. Now really this question is asking you 3 separate things. Those 3 things are, firstly, what does the source help us to understand? So what key information can we learn from the source about economic policies? The second thing then is, what doesn't it tell us? So what key information do we know about Nazi economic policies that aren't included in the source? And then the third thing, and perhaps a slightly trickier thing, is what does the provenance of the source do to the usefulness of it? So if we look at this bit here, which is the provenance, it's asking us, how does that affect the usefulness of this source? So what we'll do is we'll talk through this one together, and we'll go through the process of building up this answer, and then later in the video you'll have a chance to have a go on a different source. So first of all, what does this source help us to understand about Nazi economic policies? The first thing probably to say is it's a really kind of busy source. There's lots going on it, which can be slightly unnerving, but really we don't need to worry about that. We just need to pick out 2 or 3 key details that are helpful for understanding Nazi economic policies. So the first thing I pulled out here was that we can see there that this little cartoon of Joseph Goebbels, and what that might reveal to us then is that Goebbels used propaganda to constantly tell people how successful the economic policies were. Okay, so there's one key kind of inference that we can draw from the source about those Nazi economic policies. A second thing then, if we look at that graph in the middle, is that the focus of the Nazi economic policies, and particularly the 4-year plan, was to prioritize military spending. And we can see that because the line for spending on guns is going up rapidly, while the spending on butter is going down quite sharply there. And then just the third thing, if we look at this bottom right hand part of the cartoon, is that ordinary people had to ration their food because governments spent so much money on military that people were kind of having to really save on their spending on food. And we can see here that there's a Nazi official delivering a one dish meal to this slightly kind of dejected and depressed looking German family there. So 3 key things that this source might help us to understand about Nazi economic policies. So what doesn't it tell us? Well, this is really where some of your revision will come into play, because we just need to come up with 2 or 3 important details about Nazi economic policies that aren't included in the source. So that could be a whole number of things. The 3 things that I've gone for then are these. One thing it doesn't mention is the work creation schemes that were put into place under the new plan and that really reduced unemployment. Second thing, it doesn't mention anything about Strength Through Joy, or the KDF scheme, which was used to improve the morale of the workers. You'll remember the stuff about the Volkswagen cars and the subsidised holidays as well. And a third thing then is that the unemployment figures didn't include Jewish people after 1935, which made the economic policies seem perhaps much more successful than they were. It doesn't actually seem to mention that in the source. So I'm just taking 3 bits of my own knowledge and saying, well, actually this source is limited in its usefulness because it doesn't mention any of these key things. Which moves us on to the provenance. Remember, the provenance is really the nature and the origin and the purpose of the source. So I'm going to look at that and I'm going to say, how does this affect how useful this source is? Now, I just want to pull out some key things really. So the first thing is that the cartoon is by a Jewish journalist in America, and so what I'm going to say about that is that there may be some possible exaggeration of the negative aspects of the economic policy, because clearly these people aren't going to be fans or supporters of the Nazi Party. But let's be fair, these journalists have had first-hand experience of the policies up to 1938, therefore they probably provide quite a useful perspective. So we don't have to be really negative about the provenance. We can say that it actually boosts the usefulness of the source if that's the appropriate thing to say. So second key detail is that it's published in 1939, and what I'm going to say about that is that it means it's likely to focus on the 4-year plan rather than showing the changes in Nazi policies from 1933 right through to 1939. Okay, so I'm going to take some key details about the provenance, the nature, origin, purpose of the source, and I'm going to say how they affect how useful it is. Now, when I've taken all that into consideration, I'm ready to make a clear overall judgment on how useful the source is for understanding Nazi economic policies. This continuum here is just designed to help you with some of the language for that. So we might talk about the source being extremely useful, or on the other end we might talk about it being of really limited use. And a high quality judgment will talk about the extent of a source's usefulness. So we don't want to talk about just useful or not useful. We really want to think about the extent of its usefulness. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, just in a moment, I'm going to ask you to just pause the screen and just read through this model answer, and then we'll talk briefly about what makes it a really strong example. Okay, so what makes this a top answer? Well, 3 key things really. You'll have noticed that it uses very specific factual knowledge to point out what is and isn't shown in the source. So using specific knowledge from your revision, as always, is really helpful. Secondly, it explains precisely how the provenance of the source makes it more or less useful. So we're avoiding simplistic sentences like, it was written by some Jewish journalists in America, therefore it's biased. We're really trying to explain precisely what makes it biased, or in what ways it might be biased, or even not biased. And then thirdly, it explains an overall judgment. It takes into account the content and the provenance of the source, and it talks about the extent of the usefulness, not just a simple black and white judgment. Okay, so now that we've talked through one really clearly, I'm going to introduce you to a new question. So this question is, how useful is source E for understanding Nazi policies towards the Jews? So you've got a source there that comes from a German children's book, which is called The Poisonous Mushroom. So what I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to ask you to have a look at the source, have a read of the provenance, just remind yourself of those 3 key questions that we really want to be taken into account, and I'm going to ask you to pause the video again and give yourself 2 minutes to plan your answer. So have a go at that now. Okay, so now that you've had a good go at planning the question, I'm going to ask you to have a go in time conditions. So make sure you've got some way of just setting that timer so that you've got just about 15 minutes to have a go. Remember to try and include those 3 things that we've talked about and to reach a really clear judgment. Once you've done that, I'm going to ask you to use the next slide on the video to have a go at assessing how strong that answer is. So if you pause the video now and have a go at the answer. Okay, so what you could do now is just spend a couple of minutes using this little grid to try and work out how your answer could have been even better. I'm sure you'll have had a really good go at it. How could it be even better? So if you pause the video and have a go at that now. Okay, well done. Now then, if you're feeling particularly energetic, you could have a go at this new question now, or what I might recommend instead is giving yourself a little bit of time away from it and coming back and having a go. Remember that practicing these things will get you better and better at it, and it will mean that you're really confident going into that exam. Okay, that's all for now. Thank you.